Well, Cass Sunstein is a professor at Harvard Law School, the author of the new book, Averting Catastrophe, advisor of the World Health Organization, and senior counselor and regulatory policy officer in the Department of Homeland Security for the Biden administration. Professor Sunstein, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
Quite the list of things that you do currently and that you've done in the past. You were the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Obama administration. Can you tell us what were some of your responsibilities in that role?
Thank you for that. So the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs oversees the regulatory apparatus of the US government. So regulations involving climate change or particulate matter or food safety or pandemics or national security or agriculture or transportation or healthcare. It's a long list. And the way the system is set up, if there's a rule coming from, let's say, the Department of Transportation involving fuel economy of cars, it is submitted to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which oversees a process of assessment about whether it should see the light of day. And the process involves lots of different parts of the US government. It may be that the Environmental Protection Agency would say, this one's too weak. Or it might be that the Office of Vice President would have something to say. Or it may be ultimately the President of the United States would have something to say. And my job was to coordinate the process of assessing regulations, including many that involve climate change. And the process of coordination entails often saying, this is a good objection to what you're doing. You should make it stronger in this way, or this is a serious concern and you should maybe exempt small businesses, or you're not squaring what you're doing with what other parts of the government are doing, and that's just going to confuse the private sector. They won't know what they're supposed to do, and that's the job. It's one of the best jobs in the US government.
Well, you also worked on the team that developed the social cost of carbon, which you later referred to as the most important number that you've never heard of. So, what is the social cost of carbon and how did it come about?
Thank you. It is, I think, the most important number that people don't know about. So suppose the automobile sector, let's say, is emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. They're coming from a lot of cars every year. How do we value the damage done by that? Now, you might ask, why should we? Well, the reason is under executive orders from both Republican and Democratic presidents, in deciding how stringent a regulation should be, you need to know what you're getting from it. So if you have a regulation that makes food safer to eat, you need to know how much safer. Is it going to be like one person is going to cough less, or is it like 500 people aren't going to die? That's the benefit side. You also need to know the cost side. If you have a food safety regulation, is it going to cost $20 or is it going to cost $1 billion? And that assessment is part of the apparatus of government regulation in the United States. For regulations that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's really important to know, what does it mean to eliminate a lot of tons of greenhouse gas is? How good is that? And the social cost of carbon basically tells you. And what happened in the Obama administration is that there were a bunch of specialists. Some of them were economists, some of them were scientists, who got in a room. As I remember, it didn't have any windows, so it probably had some windows, like it didn't have any windows. And we would think, what's the best available evidence in terms of the science about the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions to the world? And that requires us to ask such questions as, if the world gets a little bit hotter, what damage is done to people who get damaged by a hotter world? Or if you get a certain level of damage in terms of, let's say, property damage, what's the monetary value of that damage? And the scientists and the economists thought it through. It was an extremely non-political process, I'm pleased to say, which is not to say that it was easy. People really dug into the best available evidence as of 2009, 2010. And the number that emerged in 2021 dollars is basically $50. And that embodies a lot of scientific judgments, a lot of economic judgments, a lot of judgments about how you value the future. Now, whether you love that number or hate that number, a lot of people love it, a lot of people hate it. It's really important because if you get a proposal, let's say, to make cars much more fuel efficient, maybe we're going to go much more electric, as President Biden has said, and that's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions a lot. How good is that? Is it a little bit good or is it a lot good? If the social cost of carbon is $2 or $4, it's going to look a lot less good than if it's $50 or $150. And so the stringency of rules that regulate power plants and that regulate not just cars, but trucks, that regulate every sector of the economy, the stringency of those regulations has been ascertained under President Trump, by the way, as well as President Obama, by reference to that number, which means it's really important. Now, under President Trump, the $50 number under President Obama went poof, kind of disappeared. It didn't go down to zero, but it went between close to zero, 2, 3, 4, really little. And I can explain a little bit why it got so small. By the way, the Obama number was upheld in federal court. And that means it was based on sound science and sound economics that a court found reasonable. The Trump number was struck down in federal court on the ground that it wasn't reasonably justified, it was arbitrary. And for any government in the US, there's a looming court challenge, which means, I think, if things are working well, you'd better pay attention to the evidence, both scientific and economic.
Well, if you don't mind, I do find it really interesting as to why the Trump administration dropped it down to almost $1. Why is that? What was the difference in the methodology between what they used and what the Obama administration used?
It's amazingly simple. You would think it would turn out to be complicated. I would think it would turn out to be complicated. It's amazingly simple. So the Obama-Biden administration made two choices that helped determine the $50 $2021 number. One is we're going to consider the damage to the world, not just the United States. So if there's a ton of carbon emissions that hits people in South Africa or Germany or Denmark or Mexico and hurts them, we're going to completely take that on board. We're going to treat that as meaningful damage, as much as if it hits Americans. The Trump administration said, no, it's domestic damage. If there's a ton of carbon emissions that hurts people in Mexico or Germany or South Africa, it doesn't matter at all. We're going to value that as zero. Now, it's probably pretty intuitive that if you take the global number under one administration and the domestic number under another administration, a $50 number is automatically going to go way down because there are billions of people to whom injuries no longer count. Second thing the Trump administration did was a little more technical, but I think also intuitive. How do you value damage done to people, let's say 100 years from now? How do you value $1 100 years from now? The answer to that question comes from the discount rate. All of us, I think, would rather $1 today than $1 in 2030, but how much less? The standard number for this kind of thing tends to be around 3%, or has until recently tended to be around 3%, and that's what the Obama administration used. The Trump administration seemed to prefer 7%. And if you discount a future dollar at 7%, then it's going to go, a current dollar is going to be turned into present value of something discounted 7% is going to be much lower than a 3%. So those two decisions basically drove the social cost of carbon from about 50 to about 2. And the federal court found it very hard to understand why the Trump administration did that. It just didn't explain itself. And we explained ourselves, whether people agree or not, we explained ourselves in detail. And for the global number, which really matters, whether you use the global number or the domestic number, we said, look, if you use the domestic number, and every country does that, then Americans are going to be hurt really badly. That if China and India and Brazil only use the domestic number, then they're going to be polluting I think the technical word is the heck out of us. Use another word. And what we need to solve the climate problem is everybody to be taking on board the damage they do to everybody. And if the United States, which has such international leadership, uses the domestic number, then we're giving a clear signal that the domestic number is the right number to use. And in international negotiations, or in our efforts to protect our citizens against harm, the use of the domestic number is extremely damaging. So we defended the global number not only on the ground that it's morally the right thing to do, it's ethically the right thing to do, but also on the ground of, as President Biden sometimes says, come on, man. Meaning you got a global problem here. And if everyone just thinks about their own citizens, you're not going to solve it.
Well, so much of averting catastrophe is, how to make the right decisions, right? And I'm curious, as you were the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, did that drive your decision to create this book? I mean, why did you want to write this book in the first place?
Well, I certainly learned a lot from my 4 years in the government then, and that was an essential background for writing this book. But the joy of it really, for me, was broader. It's that in each of our lives, as well as in public policy, there's a risk of something horrible happening. Now, that's not joyful to think about, but it's really interesting to think about. So if you go out of your house and drive, let's say, there's a risk that you're going to get hit by a drunk driver or something, and it's going to be terrible. Or if you travel, once travel resumes, something could go very wrong. So that's in the individual life. If you get married, something may have a kid who has some terrible illness, or your spouse might turn out to hate you, and it could turn terrible. You might think the chance of that is really small, but it's profoundly to be hoped that it is. But history suggests it's not zero. So we're always acting on the basis of at least some risk of catastrophe. And how should we think about that? Now, for governments, I started the book before COVID-19 started. So I didn't even see that, that is, I didn't see a pandemic as on the immediate horizon, which is a kind of tribute to one of the big themes of the book, which is sometimes we can't assess the probability. And so I got going on the book during the pandemic, actually, though it was long in gestation. And climate change, of course, is somewhere between to assign probabilities to the various outcomes is really hard, including the horrific ones. And if you think of things like, genetic modification of food or artificial intelligence turning, let's say, catastrophic for human beings, or asteroids, or things that we can't even envision, really, or only specialists envision, to get a handle on how to think about them is, there's hardly anything more interesting, I think, than that.
Well, you start the book by differentiating the definitions of risk and uncertainty. So I'd like to start there. Could you just explain, in behavioral economics terms, what those two terms mean, and why it matters to understand, their difference?
Okay, so this is going to be a tiny bit technical. I'm a lawyer, not an economist.
Okay.
So the fact that I get it suggests it's not a lot technical. But it gets us, I think, into profound issues of human life in a hurry. Okay, risk. I'm going to flip a coin. I'll give you $100 if it turns up heads, and I'll give you $200 if it turns up tails. you're operating on risk. There's 50-50% chance that it's going to turn up heads, 50-50 chance that it's going to turn up tails. If I'm going to give you a lot of money, if it turns up tails, and you're going to, anyway, you can do it so that you should take the gamble or you know what to do. With respect to many things in life, we can assign probabilities to the outcomes, either because they repeat, like a coin flip, or because there's experience from which we can extrapolate either precisely or well enough what the probability is. So if I drive from my current home 2 miles and come back, I know something about the risk of, that is the probability of something bad happening in the car. It's low. Statistically, I know pretty safe driver, it's really low, and I can assign a probability. If you invest in the stock market, I think it's plausible to say that certain investments, you're under circumstances of risk, that there's a 60% chance over a certain period you're going to make money and a 40% chance you're going to lose, and then figure it out. And you might think, this is when risk starts to get interesting, there's a 40% chance you're going to make a ton of money and a 60% chance you're going to lose some money, but not a ton. You take the gamble. We know how to think about that. And you might think, 40% chance of making $1 million, 60% chance of losing 500,000. That's okay. Or you might think, no, I'm risk averse. I don't want to do that. Probability of losing $500,000. I don't have 500,000. I have a 40% chance of making $1 million. Let some rich person take that gamble, not me. And these are all kind of tractable problems. Uncertainty, which is the really interesting one, is that you can't assign a probability to an outcome. So it might be that the chance that, I'm going to give a climate example, the chance that we're going to have horrific outcomes, where horrific is a placeholder for really, really bad, in the United States by 2100, if we don't do anything, some people will tell you we can't assign a probability to that. What is the chance that airplanes will be in use in 2300? I think that's uncertainty rather than risk. To say, I think there's a 50% chance by 2300 airplanes will be in use, that's kind of desperate and a little ridiculous. To say 10% or 90% also. We just don't know what the probability is. What is the chance that the Boston Red Sox, the best baseball team, of course, and from the standpoint of morality and character, what is the chance that they will win the World Series in at least once between 2040 and 2060? Maybe you can assign a probability to that if you work it a little bit, but you get the idea. The basic idea, which John Maynard Keynes brilliantly wrote about, was that we often proceed as if we're in circumstances of risk where we assign probabilities and can do that. But there are more situations than we think when we're in uncertainty. And to say there's a probability, 60%, 70%, 30% is speculative in the extreme, and it's kind of just making it up.
Well, so much of policymaking is under conditions of uncertainty. Unfortunately, we don't. It's hard to predict what those, the probabilities of those risks are. And you've done a lot of work in this area. So what are some of the flaws that humans, have that make it difficult for them to, make the correct decision under such conditions of uncertainty?
Okay, so let's talk about humanity and then talk about public policy. So humanity tends to use simplifying devices in thinking about whether something bad is going to happen. Here's one. Can I think of examples in which the risk came to fruition? So in the aftermath of a flood, people tend to buy flood insurance and think the risk of a flood is pretty high. If there hasn't been a flood in a while, People tend to think, I haven't experienced a flood. I don't know anyone who has. It's low. So instead of thinking of statistics, we tend to think of available incidents. And if we can think of some, our risk assessment sometimes jumps. And if we can't think of any, it plummets. It's called the availability heuristic, and it can drive risk judgments through the roof or through the floor. I think that the fact that many countries have done so little in response to climate change is partly a product of exactly what I'm describing, that people have a hard time until relatively recently attributing certain events to greenhouse gas emissions. So they think it gets hot in the summer and that's life. And sometimes we have hot summers. And, you want me to support all this regulatory stuff. I don't see it. And that's kind of human given the availability heuristic. We also know that human beings on average are optimistic, at least about themselves. So most people think that they're safer than the average driver. Even smokers have been found to think that their own personal risk is lower than that of the average non-smoker when they know for a fact that the risks of smoking are really high. They think their own personal risk is low. And we know that almost everyone thinks their sense of humor is better than the average sense of humor, which suggests that people are unrealistically optimistic. We know that people who aren't really scared of climate change, they tend to update their beliefs pretty well when they hear that things are better than they thought even. So if they hear scientific information suggesting it's not going to get that hot, people think, yeah, I was kind of in that direction anyway, and now I've learned I don't have to worry that much. But they don't update much when they get information seeing that it's going to get really, really hot. They tend to dismiss that. So what they see as bad news about the climate, they don't find credible. And what they see as good news, they do find credible. I'm not talking now about people who deny the existence of climate change. I'm talking about the bottom third of worriers, meaning they're not terribly worried, but they do agree it's going to get hotter. And they are biased in how they process information. So all of these things, the availability heuristic, unrealistic optimism, kind of a little bit, what's the right word? Non-neutral updating can get people in trouble when they think about certain risks, including climate change. That's certainly true at the individual level. And since politicians are responsive to what their constituents want, if people are dismissive of the risks associated with climate change, partly because, let's say, of optimism, then the politicians will not have a whole lot of incentive to respond.
Well, so much of averting catastrophe is about the principles that you should follow or policymakers should follow as they are navigating these uncertainty conditions. One of which is the maximum principle. A lot of the book is about when to and when not to use that principle. So can we start with could you explain what is the maximum principle?
I really got into that. So okay, so background. If I tell you that there's a 50% chance you'll win $1,000 and a 50% chance you'll lose $1 if you tell me you want to gamble, you might think that that's a pretty good gamble. There is a bad scenario of losing $1, but the good case is so much better, I'll go for it. If I tell you which do you want, a 50% chance of winning $1 million and a 50% chance of losing $5, or that's one game you can play, or a 50% chance of winning $10 and a 50% chance of losing a penny, you probably like the first gamble better than the second, even though the worst case in the first gamble is worse than the worst case in the second gamble. So the basic starting point is a good entry into life is to think what are the expected losses and what are the expected gains and what's bigger. And if you're risk averse or if the loss is one you can't bear, that might enter into your assessment. And that's kind of speaking under risk. And people don't smile and dance if they hear the word cost benefit analysis, but generally we do some kind of, all of us do rough cost benefit assessments in figuring out what options to choose. That's kind of a starting point for many of us. And under both Democratic and Republican presidents, cost benefit analysis has been kind of the presumptive rule of decision. So if you're asked to make cars safer, if it would cost $100 million but generate $300 million in benefits, go for it. If it's the opposite, maybe don't. Okay, now Maximin is, for the discussion so far, not a great idea. If you always try to maximize the worst case scenario, that is to get rid of the worst cases, you might stay home every day and not meet anybody. Because if you went out of the house, you could get hit by a car, and if you met someone, they might hurt your feelings. And maybe those worst cases are worse than the worst cases of staying home every day. So don't do that. But under circumstances of uncertainty, the idea of minimizing the worst case starts to look a lot better. So if you're in a situation where you can win, let's say, a lot of money or a lot of happiness, I tell you that. Let's say some supernatural being says, first gamble, you can win a lot of happiness, or you can be tortured and have 7 years of torture. And you're told, I'm not going to assign probabilities to those two outcomes, the supernatural being tells you. The second one is, the second gamble you can enter is you can win a little bit of money or lose a little bit of money. You might say losing a little bit of money, that's not so bad. Being tortured for years, that's really bad. And if you haven't told me the probabilities, I'm going to eliminate the worst case scenario. So this sounds kind of abstract and a little crazy, but it actually bears on life and on policy. Because remember, if we're talking about uncertainty where we can't assign probabilities to things, we can't run the numbers. We don't know what the probabilities are. So the question that the book really focuses on, and I hope it connects with daily life as well as public policy and certainly climate change, is suppose there's a worst case scenario out there and we can't assign a probability to it. Then what should we do? The interesting possibility is that we choose the option that minimizes the worst case scenario. So if you're told, you can go to some place, Greece, and there's some stuff going on in Greece that's really bad. Let's just suppose, I've just libeled Greece, but let's suppose that. But Greece is incredibly beautiful and so historic that it has some amazing appeal. Or you can go to Paris, let's say. Let's just say that the best case of going to Greece is better, because let's just say it's more beautiful in the way that you care about, and it's more historic in the way that you care about, even than Paris. But Paris doesn't have the horrible things associated with it. If you don't know what the probability is of the bad thing happening in Greece, you might say, I'm just going to get rid of the worst cases. I'm going to go to Paris. Now, if you told me the chance of the worst case coming to fruition in Greece is 1 in a trillion, I'm going to Greece. But if I don't know the probabilities, Paris. And I think this actually connects with how we think about like what our job's going to be, or where we're going to live, or who we're going to date. You might kind of fall in love with a crazy person and think the worst case scenario there is really bad. I'm going to go for the person who maybe I'm a little less wild about, but who's stable.
Well, as we face the existential threat of climate change, I mean, that is that is how we have to frame these kinds of decisions. And I think, I was very interested in the use of the maximum principle in that way. Also, I found the irreversible harm precautionary principle to be really useful. Could you explain that principle?
I'd be delighted. So you might think about certain things that you will try them if you can reverse them. So you might think, I will take a job or go to school for a certain period. If it doesn't work out, I'll go back to what I was doing before. And the fact that you can reverse it may be really important. So with a policy, you might have a policy with respect to air travel, where let's say you'll take different routes out of over Long Island, so as not to disturb, let's say, residents because it's noisy and they don't like the planes flying overhead, but you're not sure if it's a good policy. It might be disruptive to what's happening in terms of air transportation, but you'll try it and you'll reverse it if it doesn't work. And a lot of times it's really reasonable to think for policy or for life, try something, secure in the knowledge that you can reverse it. But for some problems, reversing isn't easy or isn't possible. So it may be that if you decide to take a job, let's say in another country, technically you can reverse it, but it's really hard. It's going to be very hard to unwind. For some public policies or some public policy problems, the same is true. And greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon, are in the atmosphere for a really long time. So if we don't do anything, or if we do very little about greenhouse gas emissions, we are creating something very different from the harm we create from other pollutants, where we can clean them up if we're lucky in a relative hurry. Greenhouse gas emissions, you can't do that for carbon. They're there for a long, long time. And that's very grave. So you might think that the amount of resources you'll spend or the amount you'll do to reduce an irreversible problem is much higher than the amount that you spend to reduce a problem that you could reduce, that is reversible. And as I say, what makes this intriguing to me is that it fits with ordinary life a lot. And often if you have a friend who's in some dilemma, a good thing to ask the friend is, if you do the thing that you're a little scared of, can you reverse it? If the answer is yes, go for it. If the answer is no, hesitate. For climate change, the problem is, even if we're in circumstances of uncertainty, as some people believe, meaning that saying there's a 90% chance of horror. That's not true. Some will say there's an X% chance of horror. We don't know what it is. It could be 90, it could be 20, it could be 10, we don't know. But if we can't reverse it, then it's worth doing a lot. So it's a little like buying insurance in the case of irreversible harm, where you might think that you'll spend a lot to insure something. Let's say it's precious to you, because if it's gone forever, and it's not fungible with anything else. The planet isn't fungible with anything else. It's not just like a memento. It's even bigger than that.
Well, and you talk about optionality in the book as well. So let me just give you an example here. On President Biden's first day of office, he issued a moratorium on drilling activity in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So how does this decision create option value where allowing for, the continued drilling in ANWR wouldn't do that?
Okay, great. So you might think that you want to preserve, just for you, some beautiful area, not because you're going to go, but because you want the option to go. And I think all of us think that some of the time. You might think that if you offer me a chance to buy a stock at a certain price, and you'll keep that offer open for a year, as an option, I'll pay you something. Maybe not a fortune, but something. An option is really worthwhile, is to preserve it. Now, if we destroy a pristine area, we lose our option to maintain it, possibly forever, and maybe we can restore it, but at a really high cost. So you can think of what President Biden did. It's in the same general conceptual universe as one of the coolest of the environmental laws. And I use the word cool in the ordinary language sense, like it's really cool. It's the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Trump administration didn't much like it. A lot of Republicans do like it. I think everyone should like it. And one thing it says is that before you do something that's environmentally damaging, you have to have an environmental impact statement which assesses whether the environmental damage is significant and which specifies how bad it is. So people go in eyes wide open. And one of the things that the National Environmental Impact, what the National Environmental Policy Act does is to require attention to irreversible or irretrievable losses. And what President Biden did was just saying, we're not going to allow those losses. They're not just going to harm this generation, but future generations. And let's preserve the option for them.
Well, your conclusions in the book build off the Rawlsian core precautionary principle. What is that principle, and how can it be applied to policymaking to combat the climate crisis?
So the Rawls's argument is that under circumstances of uncertainty, where we really don't know where we're going to end up, we would choose to avoid the worst case scenario, especially if by doing that, we don't lose much that we really care about. So he's thinking about justice and about people who are deciding what justice requires. And he says that we would choose a principle that would benefit the least well off if we might be among them. And the reason is that if we become catastrophically deprived, think of, devastating poverty and incapacity, we would think that was the worst case, and we would avoid that if we can't assign probabilities to various outcomes. Now that's Rawls's principle, and the adaptation of Rawls's principle that I use is to the environmental context, to say that with respect to environmentally related risks or other risks, we would choose to avoid the worst case scenario if we can't assign probabilities, at least if, or especially if, we don't lose a whole lot if we do that. So if one option creates terrible environmental damage and it doesn't cost us a whole lot, and another doesn't create environmental damage and costs us at least a little bit more, we would choose the latter, the second. And that's basically an adaptation of Rawls's idea.
So let me propose another example to you. This is a real life example. I think one that we may be hearing more and more about. Geoengineering. Geoengineering of all sorts are being proposed to combat the climate crisis. And one in particular, spraying aerosol particles into the air to block the sun and cool the earth, is gaining a lot of attention, even from Bill Gates. So given that there's a great deal of uncertainty around what could happen if the cooling is uneven, or if it disrupts weather patterns, or there's just a ton of different unintended consequences that may result from something like this, should the government be supportive of geoengineering initiatives like this, if it means that we can actually cool the planet?
Well, what the government should do, and I should say, as you noted, I'm part of it now, is keep its ears open. So to learn as much as we possibly can about the full universe of risks is a very good idea. If it's the case that there's one option, and without naming it, there's one option that would only speculatively be helpful, but would come itself with very high corresponding risks, that might not be the best option. If the science suggests that that option is very helpful potentially, and that the risks that it creates can be managed, then it's starting to look better, which is a way of saying that my book really has two faces. On the one hand, it is hopeful that through learning as much as we can with respect to all environmental problems, including climate change, we can kind of nail the right response. So I'll give an example: particulate matter, which is a very, very bad air pollutant. And we know to have a lenient policy, let's say, to particulate matter is a very hard policy to defend, given the public health risks associated with particulate matter. Not talking about uncertainty here. We're talking about known numbers of deaths that are associated with higher levels of exposure to particulate matter. Well, by known, I don't mean, we can say X, where X is a very precise number, but we know that what the range looks like, and it's high. And a lot of environmental problems have that form. But and to be as disciplined as we can about the effects of policy responses is a really good idea. That's our aspiration. But for some other problems, and climate change is arguably one, it's not like particulate matter. We know it's bad. Exactly how bad is it? If you put exactly in italics, reasonable people disagree, and a lot of reasonable people will tell you, certainly behind closed doors, but often in front of a camera and a microphone, they'll tell you, we just don't have, the science isn't there yet. So to say that we're going to create this precise amount of damage in 2100 with this amount of warming, we don't know. But we know that there's a probability of horror, and there's a probability of really, really bad, which is short of horror. And you want me to say the horror is 90% likely and the really, really bad is 10% likely? I can't do that, but I can tell you qualitatively what those things are. And then scientists who feel this way might stare you in the eye and say, and what are you going to do about that? Where the scientist isn't saying, I know exactly, but is saying nothing is not a good answer, and saying something very significant might well be, I think, is a good answer.
So obviously you have to talk about costs when you're talking about a cost benefit analysis, but are you concerned that, framing actions to combat the climate crisis as costs kind of plays into the hands of the people that don't want sufficient climate policy passed, just because it acts on our natural aversion to loss of the status quo that you talked about earlier?
You're completely right. And one of the most interesting behavioral science papers of the last 20 years, I think, is exactly on your point. The question is, that's tested, is, do people believe that climate change is real and a serious problem? Okay. A certain population is told that the response to climate change, if you agree it's real and a serious problem, the policy response is a lot of investment in activity that will lead to entrepreneurship and job creation. Then people are asked, if that's the response, do they think climate change is real? And the answer is yes, they think it's real. Then another population, which is otherwise identical to the first, is told that the policy response to climate change, if it's real, is regulation and carbon taxes and a lot of stuff to discourage carbon emissions. Do you think climate change is real? They say, no, it's not real. Now, what's cool about this study is that people's judgments about whether climate change is real is dependent on what they think the response to it is. And I think this is sometimes described as something like solution bias, that people's judgment about whether there's a problem is determined by what they think the solution is. So if you go to a doctor and says you have, let's say, a heart problem, the solution is you can't do anything but cry for the rest of your life. You might say, I'm going to get a second opinion, or you don't know anything about medicine. If the doctor says you have a heart problem and the solution is you need to do a lot of exercise and you need to eat healthier and you're going to live a long life, you might say, I have a heart problem. I'm going to eat healthier and I'm going to do a lot of exercise. So yes, it is very important for people who think that climate change is something that deserves attention, not to say, woe is us, we're all going to be poor and not going to be able to eat anymore, except maybe spinach, and we're not going to be able to get anywhere except maybe through our own feet. It's important instead to say credibly that there are a lot of foods you can eat. We're going to go towards a more environmentally friendly method of transportation, electric cars. We're going to do things that will be consistent with economic growth rather than destructive of economic growth. And to the extent that those things are credible, and my view is they really are credible, then you can get a political solution that is also responsive to the science and economics.
Well, your new book is Averting Catastrophe, and we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. Is there anywhere else online that our audience can follow your work?
Well, there's a very obscure website. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It's called Amazon.com, and you can find it under Amazon.com, and they have books, including, it appears, books by yours truly.
A lot of books by yours truly, actually, or by you.
I might add that the one we've been discussing, Averting Catastrophe, was the hardest book to write of my more than 2 books that I've written, but also in some ways, at least for the author, the most engaging book to write. Because though it's very short, it does go to the heart of the largest policy questions we're facing and kind of how we're going to live our lives.
Well, it's super helpful to read and understand, how to make better decisions on one of the most important decisions facing, governments across the world, really, in our time. So I really appreciated reading the book. Like I said, we'll definitely link to that book in our show notes. Professor Sunstein, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you. A great pleasure.